My name is Lauren Williams, and I am 70 years old. For almost 60 years, I lived as a wife, a mother, and the quiet keeper of Phoenix Orchards, a small organic apple farm in the green hills of Alabama. My hands, though stiff now with arthritis, still remember the rhythm of life on that farm. I can still feel the stretch of dough as I shaped it into sourdough bread, and I can still see the pink light of morning as I stood with James, my husband, pruning apple trees side by side. 4 weeks ago, I buried James. He and I had been married since 1979. Together, we built everything that made my life what it is: the orchard, the house, and the family. He was my partner, in every sense of the word. And yet, on the morning after his funeral, I realized something painful. What we had built might not be as strong as I once believed. Or maybe it was never enough to hold our children close. James died of pancreatic cancer. For 17 months, I watched the strongest man I knew grow weaker each day. His hands that once carried crates of apples with ease could barely lift a glass of water. The disease took him piece by piece until he was only a shadow of himself. He had asked me not to tell the children right away. Let them live their lives a little longer without this shadow, he whispered to me one night, his voice heavy with the medicine that dulled his pain. I loved him, so I agreed. But deep down, I already knew the truth. The children had drifted far from us long before cancer entered our home. Our son John, the oldest, had left for Houston years ago. He built a career in finance, moving quickly in a world of money and power. For more than a decade, he only came home a few weekends, and even then his visits felt rushed, as if he had one eye always on his watch. Judy, our daughter, lived differently but just as far from us in her own way. She moved from one wellness business idea to another, each one failing, each one needing another loan. James often gave her money, hoping she would finally succeed. But the help never seemed to end, and the businesses never lasted. When James died, I thought grief would pull John and Judy back toward us, back to the orchard, back to the love that built this house. I imagined them remembering Tuesday dinners, the smell of apple pies cooling on the counter, and the warmth of their father's laughter. But when they came for the funeral, what I saw broke my heart in a new way. They did not look like children mourning a father. They looked like professionals calculating numbers, their eyes sharp, their voices clipped, their minds already on the estate. The night after the funeral, I sat in the kitchen alone. The house felt too big without James in it. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee, though the pot had gone cold hours earlier. I sat at the dining table, the one where we had celebrated birthdays, holidays, and ordinary suppers. Its wood was worn smooth from years of use, every scratch and dent carrying a story. I placed my hand flat against the table and closed my eyes, trying to remember the sound of James's laugh, the way his presence filled the room. But instead of comfort, a heavy silence pressed in on me. My children were in the guest rooms upstairs, yet I felt more alone than ever. The orchard outside the windows stretched into the night, quiet and endless, the trees waiting for a new season. And I realized I was waiting too, waiting for something I was no longer sure would ever come. I told my children we could go through James's belongings together the next day. It was not a grand idea, just a small gesture, something a mother does to bring her family closer. I thought it would give us space to share memories, to smile, or cry over the little things that had shaped our lives. But they had other plans. The next morning, the sun shone softly through the lace curtains in the kitchen. James and I had chosen those curtains more than 35 years ago when the house was new and the orchard was still small. I brewed coffee, the plain kind James always liked. He never cared for the fancy blends. John had brought some expensive coffee from Houston, but it tasted sharp to me, almost bitter. James preferred things simple, and so I made it the way he would have wanted. I set the cups on the old wooden table and waited. When John and Judy finally came downstairs, I studied them with quiet eyes. John wore a blazer, neat and pressed, his hair carefully combed. Judy wore a silk blouse, her hair curled so perfectly that not one strand seemed out of place. They looked ready for a meeting at an office tower, not a morning remembering their father. "Mom," John said, setting his mug down carefully, the same way James used to when he wanted to be taken seriously. We've been talking. Judy gave him a quick look, then glanced at me, her lips pressed into a small smile. We think it's time to start settling things, John continued. The estate, the business, the house. I blinked at him, my heart heavy. Settling. Was that really the word he chose? It's practical, John explained. You can't run the orchard alone. And the house, it's too big. Too much for someone your age. My age. The word stung. I wanted to remind him that these hands had pruned trees through icy winters and blazing summers. I had stayed up late doing payroll when we couldn't afford help. I had baked pies for community fundraisers, driven the tractors, and delivered crates of apples to the food bank. This orchard was not too much for me. It was my life. We only want you to be comfortable, Judy said smoothly, her tone more like a sales pitch than a daughter's kindness. There's a wonderful retirement community 3 hours south. Sunnyvale Estates. You'd have friends your age, activities, all the support you need. I stood up to clear the breakfast dishes. My hands were shaking, and I needed something to do, some movement to hide my nerves. But John did not let the moment pass. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. Dad talked to me about this last year, he said, sliding papers across the table. He wanted Madison and me to take over. I looked at the documents. They were printed on John's corporate letterhead. My breath caught when I saw James's signature. It looked too steady, too neat. He hadn't written that clearly in months, not since the morphine dulled his body and his hands. This isn't from our family lawyer, I said quietly. He was lucid when he signed it. John insisted, his voice firm. I sat there, staring at the papers, my heart torn between grief, disbelief, and something colder, suspicion. He wanted this, Judy said quickly. A fresh start. There's a developer interested. $7 million for the land. We'd be set, and you'd be taken care of. A developer. They wanted to sell the orchard. To level it to the ground. To replace a lifetime of harvests, hard work, and giving back with rows of houses and streets of concrete. You're talking about selling your father's life's work, I said quietly. Mom, be reasonable, John answered. The orchard can't last forever. Something lit inside me, a slow-burning anger I had not felt in years. The same kind of fire that once made me chase off a fox from our chicken coop with nothing but a broom. I looked at both of them, my own children, and spoke with a steady voice. Show me the will. John paused, then slowly pushed the papers toward me again. I didn't reach for them. I'm going to bed, I said. We'll talk tomorrow. But deep down I knew there would be no real tomorrow conversation. They weren't grieving their father. They were carrying out a plan. That night, I did not sleep. I lay awake in the bed James and I had shared for decades. I listened to the creaks in the old farmhouse walls and the wind brushing against the apple trees outside. Every sound was familiar, comforting. It was the silence in my children's hearts that felt strange and cold. By morning, the smell of coffee drifted through the house. But it wasn't the warm, simple kind James loved. It was sharp and bitter, John's imported coffee. My body moved slowly, my joints aching, not only from age, but from betrayal. When I walked downstairs, they were already waiting, coats on, suitcases packed. One of the suitcases was not mine. We packed some essentials for you, Judy said, her voice overly bright. We thought we could drive you to Sunnyvale today. Just a look. You don't have to decide yet. I'm not going to a retirement community, I said firmly, pouring myself a cup of coffee. John glanced at his watch. Mom, be reasonable. The paperwork is done. We close with the developers next week. You can't stay here. I held my cup steady and looked at them both. I've lived here my entire adult life, I replied, calm but unshaken. This is my home, I said firmly. It's all of ours, Mom, John replied flatly. Dad left the business to us. It's time you let go. I stared at him, and for the first time, I didn't see the boy who once followed his father through the orchards asking about bees and frost. I didn't see the child who used to laugh while running between the apple rows. Instead, I saw a stranger, a man who looked at me not as his mother, but as a problem he needed to control. "I need my medication," I said quietly, stepping back. "And I'd like to take some family photos with me." Judy's shoulders relaxed, almost as if she had been holding her breath. "Of course," she said quickly. "Take whatever personal things you want. We'll ship the rest." Upstairs, I didn't cry. My face stayed calm, but inside me, something stronger than tears grew. I gathered my pills, yes, but I also reached for something they didn't know about. Behind the medicine cabinet, hidden behind a panel James had installed in the 1979s when he worried about burglars, I found my passport and birth certificate. Then, in our bedroom closet, I pushed past James's old flannel shirts and reached for a small fireproof box. It was heavy in my hands. Inside was something far more powerful than memories. The original deed to 20 acres of land, purchased in my maiden name before I was married. It wasn't just land, it had water rights. And anyone who wanted to build houses or businesses on our orchard would need that land. Without it, their plans would crumble. When I came back downstairs, my purse was heavier, but my heart felt strangely lighter. "Ready?" John asked, his voice clipped. "Sure," I said, letting Judy take my arm as though I was defeated. I let them believe I had given up. We drove past the orchard, the trees just starting to bloom with the promise of a new season. We passed the elementary school where I had once volunteered, the library where I had read to children, the familiar places that had shaped my life. But instead of turning onto the highway toward Sunnyvale, John suddenly veered onto a narrow county road. 30 minutes later, he pulled onto a gravel shoulder beside an empty, open field. "This is where you get off, Mom," he said, as casually as if he were telling me the light had turned red. Judy's smile faded. "John, what are you doing?" "She'll fight us," John said coldly. "She'll contest the will, make trouble. This is cleaner. She has clothes, her medicine. There's a gas station 7 miles up the road." He opened my door, his face set like stone. And just like that, they left me standing on the side of the road with nothing. Or so they thought. The car disappeared down the dusty road, leaving behind a cloud of dirt and the heavy sting of betrayal. I stood still, the wind pulling at my coat, holding the small suitcase they had packed for me. But I wasn't afraid. I wasn't broken. I was free. I began to walk, not toward the gas station John had mentioned so coldly, but toward town. Toward my next step. My shoes weren't made for gravel roads, and the spring sun was already warming the back of my neck. Still, with each step, my resolve grew stronger. In my purse was everything I needed: my ID, my passport, my medicine, and most importantly, the original deed to 20 acres of orchard land. John and Judy didn't know that land existed. I had purchased it in my maiden name years ago, before James and I even married. Back then, it was a safety plan in case the orchard failed. James used to call it our just-in-case land. Now, it was more than that. It was my shield. Those 20 acres weren't just ordinary land. They held the only natural water source on the whole property. Without that water, there would be no irrigation. Without irrigation, there could be no orchard and certainly no new development. My children thought they had pushed me out. They thought they had trapped me. But they didn't understand the ground they stood on. They didn't understand what legacy really meant. I did. After nearly 3 hours of walking, my feet were sore and blistered, but finally, the familiar edges of Phoenix came into view. I saw the old sign for Dalton's Gas and Grocery. The building looked the same as it always had, small, simple, and a little worn, but steady. It was a place where people still greeted each other by name, where cash changed hands with trust, not suspicion. I sat down on the wooden bench outside the store, setting the suitcase by my side. The cars came and went, drivers busy with their lives. I didn't look like much to anyone passing by, just a tired old woman resting her feet. But I knew something they didn't. I carried more than papers in my purse. I carried the truth. Timothy Dalton stepped out from behind the counter, wiping his hands on his apron. He had known me for over 35 years, ever since James and I first brought crates of apples to his store. His brow furrowed as he looked at me. "Mrs. Williams," he said gently, "you all right? You look a little pale." Just resting, Timothy, I answered, giving him a small smile. It's been a long day. Timothy's eyes moved to the suitcase at my side, then back to me with concern. Real sorry about James, he said softly. He was a good man. Yes, I nodded. Yes, he was. He hesitated for a moment, then asked gently, Do you need to use the phone? If it's not too much trouble. I followed him inside, past shelves of canned peaches, old boxes of cereal, and dusty jars of jam, until we reached a small office in the back. The phone sat on the desk. I picked up the receiver and dialed a number I still knew by heart. Our family lawyer, Eric Roberts. He answered on the first ring. Amanda, he said, his voice filled with surprise. I've been trying to reach you. I expected you at the will reading. My grip on the phone tightened. What reading? I asked. There was a pause on the other end. Then Eric spoke again, slower this time. John presented a will. But I had concerns. It didn't match the file your husband and I updated last year. I need your help, I said firmly. And your discretion. You have both, Eric replied without hesitation. My office. 1 hour. I hung up the phone and turned back to Timothy. Do you sell prepaid phones? He nodded. A few. Want one? Yes. And a bottle of water. When I reached for my wallet, he shook his head. On the house. Mrs. Williams, if you need anything else, you just say the word. His kindness nearly broke through my calm. But I hadn't cried when I buried James, and I wasn't going to cry now. I had work to do. I wasn't finished yet. Eric Roberts' office was on the second floor of an old Victorian house on Main Street, right across from the town library. He had been our lawyer for more than 35 years. Eric was a man who wore sweater vests without irony and still trusted a handshake as much as a signature. His secretary, Marilyn, gasped softly when she saw me walk in. Mrs. Williams, she said kindly, Mr. Roberts is expecting you. Would you like a glass of water? Coffee? I'm fine, thank you, I replied. Eric himself came out to meet me at the doorway. He hadn't changed much since James's last visit. Maybe a little more stooped, but his eyes were still sharp and full of focus. Amanda, he said warmly, guiding me not to the desk, but to a pair of leather chairs near the window. He sat across from me, his face serious. Tell me everything. So, I told him everything. I told Eric about the funeral, about the will John had shown, about the way my own kitchen had turned into something that felt more like a boardroom than a family home. I told him about the long drive, and how they left me on the side of the road with nothing but a suitcase. Every detail. Eric never interrupted. He only listened, his face growing darker as I went on, nodding now and then, but saying nothing until I was finished. When my story was done, I reached into my purse and pulled out the small fireproof box. From it, I removed the original deed to the 20 acres James and I had put aside decades ago, in my name. I laid it gently on the desk. Eric lifted the document with careful hands, studying it in silence. Then he looked at me, his voice low but firm. Amanda, this is gold. This isn't just land. This is power. With the water rights and zoning attached, the developer can't touch the orchard without this deed. I know, I said. He leaned back in his chair, tapping the paper thoughtfully. The will John brought in, it's a forgery. I suspected it the moment I saw it. The signature was too neat, too smooth, far too clean for a man who was under hospice care. I knew it wasn't James's hand. So, we challenge it? I asked. We will, Eric replied, his voice steady. But that will take time. For now, we use this deed. You legally own the most critical piece of the orchard. They cannot move forward with any sale without your consent. I drew in a breath. I want my home back, I said quietly. And I want my children to understand what they've done. Eric nodded. Then we'll make them understand. First, I'll draft a letter to the developer. They need to be warned that the property is not what they were promised. Will they back out? I asked. If they're smart, yes. Developers don't like lawsuits. They especially don't like land with incomplete rights. Too risky. Eric stood now, his movements sharp and full of purpose. I also know a judge in district court. We can get a motion filed to freeze the sale until everything is settled. I turn my gaze out the window. Across the street, a young couple walked hand in hand, their laughter floating in the air, unaware of the storm quietly starting inside this small office. "I don't want revenge, Eric," I said, almost more to myself than to him. "I just want the truth. And peace." "You'll have both," Eric promised. It started right away. By noon the next day, Eric had filed an emergency order to freeze any transfer of ownership for Phoenix Orchards. A courier hand-delivered the legal notice to the development company John and Judy had been working with. Within hours, the deal was put on hold. The developer, faced with sudden legal trouble and the discovery that the most important part of the land, the acres with the only natural water source, was owned separately and never disclosed, began to panic. Their lawyers contacted Eric quickly, asking for clarification. I told them the truth. Eric said as we sat in his office, papers spread out in front of us. "The land deal is incomplete. The water rights cannot be transferred. And most importantly, your children don't have the authority they claim." That evening, my prepaid phone buzzed. It was a text message from Judy. For the first time since they had abandoned me on the roadside, she reached out. "Mom, please call me. We need to talk. John's freaking out. We didn't know about that other land. Can we just fix this?" Fix this. I stared at those words, my chest heavy. There was no apology, no regret for what they had done. Only fear now that the money was slipping out of their hands. I did not reply. Later that night, John called Eric directly, his voice sharp and demanding, trying to take control again. Eric stayed calm and firm, telling him that from now on, everything would go through legal channels. "They're realizing," Eric said after hanging up, "that they miscalculated badly." "They thought I had nothing left," I replied. "But I had everything they forgot to value." Eric looked at me with quiet pride. "You're handling this with Williams, Amanda. Many people would have chosen anger or revenge." "I've lived too long with kindness in my bones to turn bitter now," I said softly. "But I will not stay silent either." Outside, life in Phoenix carried on as usual. Children rode their bikes down quiet streets, a dog barked in the distance, someone pushed a mower across their lawn. Life here was still simple, still honest. And I intended to keep it that way. The land would not be sold. Not now. Not like this. The orchard James built, the legacy of his hands and heart, was never meant to be treated as a business deal. It was home. And I wasn't finished protecting it. In the weeks that followed, I did not go back to the old farmhouse. Instead, I rented a small apartment above the bakery on Main Street in Phoenix. It was simple, but it had a tiny balcony just big enough for a rocking chair and a few pots of herbs. In the mornings, the smell of cinnamon and fresh bread floated up from the shop below. It wasn't the home James and I had built, but it was mine, and that was enough. I slowly began to rebuild my days. On Friday nights, I returned to the community center to teach quilting, just like I had done years ago. On weekends, I held workshops at the library, teaching organic gardening and sustainable fruit farming. Teenagers came, retirees came, and even young couples hoping to start their own farms. They listened, not because I spoke loudly, but because my words carried years of experience and love for the land we had cared for so long. The water rights to the 20 acres, I placed those in a trust with the Phoenix Agricultural Cooperative. That way, young farmers in town could use them, not sell them. They would care for the orchard and the soil the same way James once had. That was the future I wanted, one rooted in growth and care, not money. John and Judy kept their distance. I heard rumors that the developer had pulled out completely, that the false will was being challenged in court, and that both of their reputations had taken serious damage in their cities. But I didn't celebrate their downfall. I didn't need revenge. Peace, for me, was stronger than bitterness. Truth had spoken for itself. The orchard remained untouched. In spring, the trees bloomed just as they always had, white blossoms filling the fields like falling snow. Whenever I walked past, I smiled, not with anger, but with the calm strength of a woman who had reclaimed not just her land, but her voice. They had underestimated me. They thought I would break, quietly. But instead, I remembered who I was. I often think back to that day on the gravel road, standing alone with a suitcase I hadn't packed, watching my own children drive away without a second glance. That moment should have shattered me. But it didn't. Because in that silence, I finally heard the truth I had ignored for too long. Love is not blind loyalty. And being a mother does not mean accepting betrayal. Just because you raised the ones who betrayed you doesn't mean you are weak. John and Judy thought they could erase me. They believed that because I was older, grieving, and alone, I wouldn't fight back. That I would have no choice but to give them everything. But they forgot something. Before I was a wife, a mother, or a widow, I was Lauren Williams, a woman who built a life with her hands, her heart, and her mind. I never needed to shout to be strong. What they called weakness, my silence, my trust, my love, was actually my strength. Those things protected me when nothing else could. If you're listening to this, and you've ever been pushed aside, underestimated, or treated like a shadow in your own life, I want you to hear me. Your strength is not measured by how loudly you fight. Your strength is knowing what you stand for and standing firm, even when you stand alone. That quiet strength carries more power than any betrayal. My orchard still stands. My name is still on the deed. And my life, it's mine again. So to anyone who has ever been told, this is where you get off, I say this. If you must walk away, do it. But don't leave your worth behind. Walk with purpose. Walk with quiet power. And when you are ready, tell your story. Because your story matters. And it might just give someone else the courage to rise too. If this story touched you, please like, share, and leave a comment. And if you've ever been underestimated but found your strength, tell us. Someone needs to hear it.